A very warm greetings to you all. Welcome to another Asian Productivity Organization Productivity Talk. I am Fulori Nasautu-Iraqi, Productivity Officer with the Ministry of Employment, Productivity and Industrial Relations, and also the APO Liaison Officer for Fiji. Today we will discuss the important topic of boosting public sector productivity by navigating complexities. Policymakers face a challenging landscape and have to make critical choices under uncertainty with unpredictable outcomes and limited information. Their decision often results in some unintended consequences. To navigate this complexity, a new approach is needed. This speed talk explores complexity theory and how it can be applied to public policy. We'll delve into the principles and mechanism of complex adaptive systems, those with many interconnected parts. By understanding these systems, policymakers can learn to harness their dynamics for better outcomes. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Olga Siemers. Hello, Dr. Olga.
Hello,
and thank you for joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you so much.
Dr. Olga Siemers is a senior lecturer in public policy in the International School for Government at King's College, London. Her research looks at the intersection of government policy, decision-making, and risk management in the context of global uncertainty and digital transformation. She is a program director for the Executive Master of Public Administration and postgraduate diploma in professional policy-making programs offered to the mid-career civil servants through the UK civil service policy profession. We now welcome Dr. Olga to share her insights on our topic tonight, boosting public sector productivity by navigating complexities.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your introduction, Fulori, and more importantly, thank you so much for inviting me to provide this talk. It's a great pleasure to speak about boosting public sector productivity by navigating complexity. During this talk, I'm planning to cover the following 5 points. First of all, I will start talking about the rise of global uncertainty. We will discuss the factors which contribute to the rise of uncertainty. Then we will move on and talk about what does it actually mean for public sector productivity, also defining productivity. We will then move on and talk about how we can boost productivity by navigating complexity, trying to understand what is the difference between a complex, complicated, and rather simple policy challenge, or even sometimes we talk about daily choices and decision-making we have to face as not only public officials, but as private citizens. After it, we will talk about a phenomenon which is called the boomerang effect, and we will discuss the unintended consequences. We will talk about the questions how we can anticipate, even not prevent, but at least mitigate for certain impacts, which we probably do not wish to see in the public sector unfolding. But we will also discuss how we can capitalize on certain positive outcomes, which sometimes we not anticipate and do not intend, but they may happen. And it's a great opportunity for productivity to be boosted, increased, and we need to make the best use of these options. Finally, we will talk about the robust decision-making strategies and how we can put this in place in the public sector to prevent the worst possible outcomes, but also to make the right decisions in the right circumstances.
Thank you, Dr. Olga. Public sector productivity is often viewed as a complex topic, with lots of research focused on improving the measurement of outputs and the key drivers of productivity growth. As an introduction, Dr. Olga, can you explain to the viewers what public sector productivity is and why is it important?
Basically, productivity is how much output is produced relative to the inputs which are used to get to that outcome. As you can see, this is a rather linear definition, so we can measure productivity, for example, by calculating worker hours for labor productivity. Yet, when we talk about the public sector, the phenomena are rather multifaceted. Public officials, they deal with grand challenges, sometimes on a daily basis. They have to sometimes address immigration crisis. They have to think how to deal with the climate change related issues and assure sustainability. So in many cases, it is actually rather hard to measure productivity. However, it doesn't mean that it is impossible. We need simply to adopt different strategies and different thinking approaches, different perspectives, such as, for example, the systems perspective, which we will talk about later on today, in order to be able to measure productivity and to account for all different outputs. For example, think about a cyber attack. When public officials put in place some great mitigation mechanisms and by major collaborative efforts, work between government departments and agencies, they managed to prevent a cyber attack. Well, think about a cyber attack, preventing it as an output in this public sector productivity concept. When you have the right measures in place, you may prevent not only one, but multiple cyber attacks. And you see, they have never happened. So you can't even know how many you have prevented. You can see it is rather challenging sometimes to put these measures in place, so to account how much does it mean and what is the scale of this output, because certain things in the public sector are rather intangible and not easily measurable. However, we do not always need to quantify this output. Sometimes we can just put some better measures in place by adopting different thinking approaches. So let's talk about the rise of global uncertainty. First of all, uncertainty is neither good nor bad. As human beings, we tend to feel a certain sense of unease. We are uncomfortable when we feel uncertain. However, we need to embrace this different perspective. There is only one certain thing in government, and that is that change will come. So it is better to be prepared. What are the key contributing factors which contribute to the rise of global uncertainty? As you can see on your screen, innovation in science and technology is growing and becoming highly transformative, or indeed disruptive. It is exciting, and we're often excited and thrilled about certain innovations and certain technological opportunities. However, sometimes it may become disruptive. The global order is changing. There is a lot to say about it, but without going into great details, I can only say the global order has always been changing. However, what is a real change now? The speed of changes has increased. So these factors, they're coming at us, including public officials, at a greater speed. So we have to react much faster. The greater capability and sometimes lower price of so-called dual-use technologies, for example, drones, mobile phones, computers, means that such technology is available to different actors. I will just move on with the other contributing factors. Social media, you will all certainly recognize it. It can empower the rise of social, sometimes political movements, leading sometimes to unexpectedly fast and also powerful mobilization, which in certain cases can be positive. In some other cases, again, it can be disruptive. It might be acting against the state. And finally, non-state actors. Their meaning has definitely increased, has grown. They have partly benefited from this environment. So having access to dual-use technology at a lower price, also social media, and the innovation in the technological space more generally, that means they gain access, non-state actors gain access to more powerful and cheaper technology to gain agency and influence. I would like to highlight these factors are not negative. They're also not positive. So these are just factors we need to consider for the public sector. Let's move on to the next question and ask ourselves, so what does it actually mean for public sector productivity? There are some negative impacts which we need to consider, but there are also some positive impacts. Let's start with the negatives so we can move on to the positives. Risk aversion. Under uncertainty, people tend to become risk averse. And in case of the public sector, well, it's fair enough, because we have to deal with public spending, we have to allocate money wisdomly, and we have to prioritize. Resource allocation. When uncertain factors come into play, sometimes it may be challenging because we have already allocated a pot of resources towards solving one problem, and another problem comes as we have to face it rapidly. It's very challenging to allocate resources mindfully. And finally, employee morale. As I said at the outset, it's uncomfortable to be uncertain. People don't like it, and therefore it may affect employees within the public sector. Moving on to the positive side of this story, there are also positive factors and positive impacts, and I would like to urge public officials to consider them as much as possible. Innovation, it's a great time to innovate. Sometimes it's really good to offer some innovative ideas, and you can find that there is a greater chance for collaboration, also faster decision making within the public sector under uncertainty, because you can explore space and make something great and something good in absence of certain restrictive factors. I will show in a case study in a minute how it may work out in practice. Collaboration. Well, collaboration is the key, really, in terms of addressing complex policy challenges and in terms of how you can start thinking in systems. The key message here is to collaborate. Collaborate across sectors, public and private sectors. Reach out to non-governmental organizations if needed, but also establish collaboration within the public sector between different government departments, agencies. Sometimes it's really useful to reach out to a colleague who probably is outside of your immediate circle and try to solve a problem together. And finally, we can better and faster prioritize things when we face uncertainty, simply because we have to. Prioritization works tend to work out better in the public, but also the private sector, when there are many uncertain factors which we have to face. We simply have to prioritize. We have to put our resources to address the most pressing challenges of today. I would like to provide you an example, and this is a case from Estonia, Estonia's e-residency program. This example is supposed to demonstrate how you can make the best use out of the uncertain factors around you as public sector officials. In the early 2000s, Estonia faced economic uncertainty. They needed to find ways to attract investment and also to grow their economy. And remember, it is a rather small country. They don't have a large domestic population. Estonia saw an opportunity in the lack of established regulations for online businesses and made the best use of this lack of regulations.
Thank you, Dr. Olga. In the earlier slides, you also mentioned the changing global order and how it is fascinating to see how Estonia capitalized on the lack of regulations for online businesses and became an innovative hub for startups. Now, when we look at crypto's contribution to an ever-changing world order, what are your insights on this in terms of economic growth and development, especially on least developed countries?
Thank you so much for your excellent question, Fulori. Well, I would like to start with a quote, a rather famous phrase by Winston Churchill, and that is, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." I think this phrase can inspire us all because a crisis, as in Estonia's case, always opens up an opportunity to do something new, an opportunity to innovate, and also to embrace new phenomena, to embrace changes. Sometimes we can be more efficient during the time of crisis. We just need to become better at anticipating and making the right choices, also in a more speedy manner. So in terms of cryptocurrency, as you just mentioned, Flori, I would like to suggest one piece of advice. This new phenomena, these fascinating technological developments, innovations, they are not going to go away if we just try to pretend that we would like to do business as usual and ignore such phenomena. They will only become bigger and they will carry on impacting public services across the national borders. The thing is that governments tend to mostly operate nationally, while many technological phenomena, many online businesses and cryptocurrency included here, they tend to operate across the national borders. So we need to embrace this phenomena. We need to sometimes update our ways of working, adopt a different perspective, and make sure that we collaborate across the national borders as much as possible. Otherwise, it is really challenging to address the phenomena which develop and speed up rapidly. Coming back to the innovation from Estonia, the e-residency program, well, what they did, they wanted to make use of the lack of established regulations for online businesses. In 2014, Estonia launched the e-residency program, granting digital residency to anyone in the world. So the program carries on until today. It still exists. Anyone in the world can pay just very small amount of money and open and become an e-resident of Estonia, for example, open a business bank account and run a digital business entirely online from anywhere else. There is no need to move to Estonia. What happened? This allowed entrepreneurs to establish and run companies in Estonia completely online, completely remotely, attracting foreign investment and boosting the economy. It was a great success. Over 100,000 e-residents from around the world joined the program, and Estonia has become really a hub for innovative startups. As you probably can realize, this program has significantly contributed to Estonia's economic growth. So this case study is supposed to illustrate how we can make use of certain uncertain circumstances. Let's move on to the next point and ask ourselves a question: how we can boost productivity by navigating complexity. So what can we do in practice to make sure that we get the right outcomes? Scenario planning is the key. Start thinking in scenarios. Start anticipating what may come. Well, obviously, we can't have magic helping us, telling us the future. This is impossible. But what we can do, we can develop a set of plausible scenarios and develop strategies which are more robust. We will talk about robustness in a few minutes, and more to make the public sector more resilient, robust and data-driven decision-making, and also adopting a so-called systems approach. Our world includes many interconnected systems, and these are systems with many interconnected elements. And connections, relationship is really the key here. For example, we have physical systems which fulfill a function such as human body or solar system. We also have social systems which follow a purpose, such as, for example, education system, healthcare system. Government would be a system as well. A university is a system. And even your team of co-workers is a system too. So the thing about systems, they are really changing all the time. They are evolving, co-evolving, and they affect each other. Everything is connected to everything else. To address challenges and to adopt this new perspective, you need enhanced communication, because this is the only way to establish good collaborative practices. Prepare to communicate more transparent, better, and simply just more frequently. You need to reach out to connections which are sometimes outside of your immediate circle of connections and enhance communication. Let us define complexity asking a question. So what is the difference between simple, complicated, and complex problems? Let's start with simple problems. A simple problem is like baking a cake. It can be solved by choosing and applying an algorithm. So as soon as you know how to bake a cake, you have an instruction, you have all the ingredients, you have a functional kitchen, you can bake a cake. Some of us are better bakers than some other of us, but basically it is possible. Expert knowledge is not required, but it may help. And it is straightforward, and this is crucial, to adapt your algorithm to a new objective. As soon as you manage to bake one cake, you can bake 10, 100, 1,000, given you have the resources which are required. Complicated problems are, well, larger scale, but basically they're very similar to simple problems. It's like building a space rocket or sending it to space. You can see high levels of expertise are needed. It is much more expensive and also resource intensive. However, there is still a clear algorithm to follow. And then you can, as soon as you manage to build one rocket, if you have enough money and people power, you can build 10, 100, 1,000 etc. So let us look at the complex problems. And these are the problems public officials tend to face much more frequently rather than the complicated or the simple ones, such as climate change related sustainability or immigration. They're all complex policy challenges. So what is the difference here? The difference is that there is no algorithm. You have always to start from scratch. Expert knowledge cannot guarantee the desired outcome. It is really not like baking a cake. For example, developing a city infrastructure is always different. You cannot just take the center of London and place exactly the same infrastructure in a different geographical location, in a different place. You probably would fail because the relationship between people and the spaces they use within a city is different. People have different preferences depending on climate, depending on the weather, depending on their habits and culture. So it is highly contextual, and we need always to start from scratch. A good example, which many could relate to, is like raising a child. If it's really not like baking a cake, and it's not like building a space rocket, because if you manage to raise one child successfully, it's a great adult, responsible adult, etc. And then you have another child, you do all the same things, but you may not get the same outcome because of relationship between parent and child. You have changed. It's a different personality. Whatever involves human beings is essentially complex, and relationships are important. Experience helps, but it has its limits. When you start adopting the systems perspective, so you start see the connections between the systems, such as education and healthcare, that can really help. Let's move on at this point and talk about the so-called boomerang effect and unintended consequences. This what can really justify why we need to adopt a different perspective, because sometimes the best intentions may backfire, and the policies which were really well designed, well prepared, may just not work out as well as we thought as public officials. What is an unintended consequence? It is a particular effect of purposive action, which is different from what was wanted at the moment of carrying out the act. So here we assume that we know what was wanted at that moment. We know what was our intention. We assume it hasn't changed. And also we assume that the action is purposive. Well, you may say there are quite a number of assumptions there.
Now, Dr. Olga, in the first part of your presentation, you explained the rise of global uncertainty and that rapid change is transforming our world. Now, on the one hand, we experience progress of information technology, which sort of stuns and amazes us. But on the other hand, major changes have taken place, such as the effect of greenhouse gases on the global climate, that have sort of threatened our very own survival system. Now, sometimes our well-intended efforts to solve a problem opens up unanticipated reactions. Now, how does policy resistance arise, and how can we learn to avoid it and find productive policies that can produce sustainable benefit?
I'm really glad you mentioned this question, Flori, because it's an excellent idea to talk about the phenomenon called policy resistance. Well, policy resistance is simply a phenomenon when it's a failure of policies to achieve the desired outcome. Why this failure happens? Because our actions, our well-designed policies may trigger some feedback, some reaction from the environment, from the system we are dealing with. And these waves of feedback may sometimes go beyond affecting just one system. You may do something in the space of healthcare and you would affect education in positive or in a negative manner. So unintended consequences are not always negative. However, policy resistance is rather a problem because you really want your policies to work out as intended, at least to an extent. And when you fail to achieve the desired outcome, that is normally because people react differently to what you anticipated as public official. I will give you an example. And it's a very typical example, a reaction on an abortion ban which we saw throughout the human history in many places around the world. When government tried in any country, in any context, to increase domestic population by banning abortions, it actually caused the negative impact and the very opposite impact. The very problem has exacerbated and actually increased instead of being solved, because many people, they had to conduct illegal abortions, unfortunately, and it affected their health to a worse extent. And overall, the whole population was, not the whole population, but a major part was affected rather negatively. So sometimes policy resistance may lead to actually increasing and exacerbating the very problem we are trying to address. Thank you for your question, Flori. Let's move on and talk about the different types of unintended consequences. You can see this very simple metric in front of you on your screens, and the message to say is rather straightforward. There are positive impacts and also negative impacts. There can be an impact on objective, and there can be an impact on something else, so on another aspect of a policy or public life. We will talk about some examples, but let's just define the types. If we see a positive impact on the objective of the policy we introduced, well, that's the intended consequence. That's the right thing, that's success. If we see a negative impact on the objective, we call it a perverse effect, such as, for example, in case of the abortion ban, to an extent it affected health, and it didn't affect the number of children in many countries in the end, which tried to introduce such a ban. If we talk about a positive impact on something else, on another aspect, we call it a serendipity of effect. And sometimes we introduce a policy and we can see there is a side benefit, basically, to something else, which is a great opportunity for public sector officials to make use of. And finally, the negative impact on another aspect we can call a side effect.
Now, complexity is a common feature of a growing number of policy issues in a globalized world, and employing sophisticated technologies and running against resource constraints. Now, my question is, Dr. Olga, how can public officials address these complex systems such as income inequalities, setting minimum wages to avoid profiteering and exploitation?
This is a great case to discuss. Thank you for your question, Flori. Well, on the slide, which you can see now, and the previous one, the minimum wage, setting minimum wage or increasing the minimum wage would be likely to produce a positive effect on another aspect of your objective. So serendipitous effect, we call it. Boosting productivity by increasing the minimum wage. How this may work out in practice. You set a minimum wage or you increase it, and you may reduce the labor turnover because people are more happy to stick to their jobs. They get more money into their pockets, and therefore they will just stay in jobs for longer because they're more satisfied. When the labor turnout is reduced, we have people who keep their jobs. Businesses in the longer run can actually think, well, let's provide some training opportunities because we know it is more productive to have well-trained staff, and they may provide training, better training to their employees, or maybe more employees will have access to training or better training. And therefore, we have reduced labor turnover, we have more money in people's pockets on average, and we have better trained staff who can work well, who can keep their jobs for longer. And therefore, we can have an increased productivity overall. We can see impacts across the labor markets. We can see the companies benefiting, but also the economy benefiting as a whole. I think it's a great example, and the message I would like to send to the public sector officials is capitalize on those positive effects which you can achieve across different waves of consequences. Try to anticipate them and try to argue, to explain, for example, to your businesses, to small and medium-sized enterprises, which in the short term may not always perceive increase of minimum wage as a good thing for them. There may be some resistance. So to avoid such resistance, you really need to explain how the positive impacts will arise in medium and longer term. Let's go through some other examples to understand how the policy consequences work out in practice. Intended consequence. So if a government introduces a birth planning program, and as a result of it, you can see a reduced number of births in the medium term or in the long term, well, that's the intended consequence. That is the thing we wanted to achieve. Perverse effect, what can it be? An attempt to stimulate economic growth in the country through deregulation may cause perverse effect. How does it work? There is an economic argument that when we deregulate, sometimes businesses tend to minimize their cost as a strategy. And this tends to slow down the rate of economic growth in the longer run. So deregulation, I'm not saying it is always a bad idea. Sometimes it is actually a good idea. We saw how Estonia capitalized on the lack of regulation. But we have to be cautious and careful, remembering these economic arguments that there may be some perverse effects in place. We discussed the serendipitous effect in the example of increasing or setting the minimum wage. And finally, side effect, an economic policy aiming to promote a greater geographical mobility can mean in practice that we can see a higher divorce rate in certain locations because couples would work in different places. Maybe they have a discount, say, on a train ticket, or they can have free tickets to get to work. So they seek jobs in different locations, and it may negatively affect family life, and we can see a higher divorce rate, which is definitely not good overall for public sector productivity in the long run. So I would like to introduce you a case study. I think it is a wonderful example which can demonstrate how the best possible intentions and really good policies sometimes may backfire, not because it was intended so, but simply because people do not always react and do not always do how governments want them to. Sometimes they do their own thing, and their choices are not always rational, fortunately or unfortunately. So what is microcredit? It's a policy of providing small loans to poor people, sometimes poorly educated, sometimes even illiterate, to promote entrepreneurship and reduce poverty. This policy was introduced in 1983. By 2009, there was an estimated 74 million people around the world holding microloans. A total of $38 billion in microloans could be evidence. In 2005, UN declared the year 2005 as the International Year of Microcredit. So it was a great success and actually continues being so, not without any hurdles, as I will see in a minute. In 2006, Mohamed Yunus was the creator of this idea, was awarded a Nobel Prize for the idea of introducing microloans and microcredit. So there we can see unintended consequences in this case. First of all, unintended consequences, positive and negative, of any policy will always arise. This is something we cannot stop. This is only something we can better anticipate. And that is what I'm trying to say by this example. A microcredit industry has developed that in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, resulted in profiteering and exploitation. Sometimes people choose to behave not how governments anticipated and wanted them to. So there was a reaction from government officials in many countries. They realized quickly that stronger control mechanisms are really needed. In 2006, Microcredit Regulatory Authority was established in the Republic of Bangladesh, for example, to monitor all microfinance operations within the country. And in 2007, the European Commission introduced the European Code of Good Conduct for microcredit provision. It shows that in such a case, regulation, a strong regulation and strong control mechanisms are needed. So sometimes when we introduce a policy, which is an excellent idea, and we can see some great benefits, like in this case, around the world really, We shall also think about control mechanisms, mitigations, and anticipate that people will not always behave like we plan them to. Moving on to the final point of this talk, I would like to discuss robust decision-making strategies. Well, let's first outline what is this strategy useful for. This is only a useful method when uncertainty is sufficiently high. It is also only useful when you have a rich set of decision options. When you only have one decision to go for, because either you have some political constraints or you have budgetary limitations, and in any case you only have one option, well, there is no help in adopting any robust decision-making strategies. You need to have a rich set of decision options. And key actors either don't know or disagree on the key parameters relevant to the decision. When you have these circumstances, such as in many of our examples we talked about today, from climate change up to managing an immigration crisis or cryptocurrency regulation or anything else, robust decision-making strategies would be really a great idea. So let's find out what is a difference between robust and an optimal decision. A robust decision is never an optimal one. Choosing the best decision option means an optimal performance. That is an optimal decision. It only works under certain circumstances, however. So you choose your optimal performance, but it does not work under a range of circumstances. It is only suitable when we are pretty sure about the future and how the situation will unfold. So when uncertainty is higher, we are less sure, we have a broader range of plausible futures, plausible scenarios, it is better to adopt a robust decision-making approach. An optimal decision is typically regarded as most likely to happen. So when we think about likelihood and we have the most likely scenario in front of us, we can adopt our optimal decision because it's about the optimal performance. Probability and likelihood is the key parameter here to make decision. So what about a robust decision? What is a robust decision? It means you have to trade the optimal performance for higher independence on assumptions. That means plausibility is much more important than likelihood. You have to prepare for a range of different plausible futures and scenarios, and you have to make a decision which will work across a broader range. What you have to do, you have to compromise. You can't go with an optimal performance. You have to give up. You have to accept some trading some parts of optimality in order to be prepared for future threats and any potential future options. So your decision is not optimal, but it works under more future scenarios. I will give you a very simple, straightforward example. Making seat belts use compulsory is regarded as a robust decision. So why is it so? It's actually quite efficient. It's evidence-based. Extensive research shows that seat belts actually provide great safety and can prevent death or major injuries across a number of possible scenarios, which we can have in case of a car accident. It has a long-term impact. It's not only short-term, because there is again evidence when we use seat belts, we contribute to general road safety. We tend to behave safe as driver because the seatbelt reminds us that we are in circumstances which are rather risky on the road driving in our car. So we have to be careful. We have to follow the rules. We have to stop by the red light and so on. Flexibility, it's a basic principle. Wearing a seatbelt remains constant, but in case of a child, we can also add a car seat and adjust to the needs of a child. But also, it's also relatively cheap. So what is the trade-off here? The trade-off is that we give up a part of our individual liberty and we accept compulsory seatbelts. It's a robust decision because it works across a range of scenarios, and seatbelts have saved so many lives of children and adults across the globe. Let us look at this case study. It is called Building with Nature program. The case study comes from the Netherlands, and it's about the floodplain building code. So half of the world population lives in deltas of rivers, and that is expected to rise to 70% by 2050. That is a general overall anticipation. However, we cannot be as precise in every single location, so we don't know how the water will rise in every single place, including some locations within the Netherlands. We cannot predict the exact frequency or intensity of future floods, but we know that it will increase. The intensity will be higher and the frequency will be higher. We just don't know how much higher. Climate change adds, obviously, further uncertainty to these predictions. So what are our options here? We have two options, really, on the extreme sides of a scale. A purely optimistic approach, so business as usual, basically, building codes based on historical flood levels. We do not anticipate, we do not accept that the flood levels will be higher, and we keep doing our business as usual scenario, building codes based on just historical data. It can end up in a disaster if a worse flood occurs. It can cost us lives and livelihoods. On the other hand, we can introduce overly restrictive codes, and that's the other end of this scale, and it might be just too expensive. And also unnecessarily, in many cases, if major floods are rare, we don't need to have overly restrictive codes. Robust decision in this case would involve identifying a range of possibilities. So we need data. We need to look and make some scenario development about the frequency and also intensity of future floods. As much as possible, we need to look at scenarios. We need to evaluate trade-offs, and the trade-offs here are basically cost of implementing more restrictive building codes and saving lives, livelihoods, and protecting the environment around the deltas on the other side. We need to build in some flexibility. And how can we do that? We, in case of the Netherlands, building with the nature, it was decided that it is important to really build with the nature and not to act against the nature. They implemented a robust approach to create a building code that is effective, so it protects residents and property from most flood events. But it is also adaptable. It can be adjusted, the building code and the building can be adjusted to handle some unexpected situations. Sometimes it means changing the level of building, maybe building a little bit further away from the deltas. And sometimes it means actually managing the flood rather than managing the building. And it is also cost conscious. So the building code in the Netherlands balances safety with economic feasibility and can be considered a great example of a robust decision-making approach in this case. Let us talk about a phenomenon called the saddle paradox. The best, and just think about this statement. The best you can do, according to some criteria, is absolutely worst you can do according to some other criteria. So the sweet point is really in the middle. You need to compromise and you need to consider different criteria. You can not only focus, say, only on costs. You can also not only focus on safety, however, safety is important. You have to compromise and you have to find a trade-off, so your decision is somewhat in the middle between cost and safety, and it is adaptable, adjustable, but also cost-effective to prevent most future events scenarios, like in our case. I would like to highlight the main point of this talk, and this is really about collaboration, is the importance of collaboration. I think the best way to demonstrate not only the importance, but also the challenges and the dilemma really arising related to collaboration is to talk about the game theory in action. So I would like to introduce you to the famous prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a classic example of a non-zero-sum game or a win-win game where one decision maker gain does not necessarily result in another decision maker's loss. And imagine there are two criminals, let's call them Alice and Bob. They conducted a crime and they were caught and they were put in prison. However, there is not enough evidence. There is some evidence on them. There is not enough evidence to convict them. What is happening? They're offered to confess, or they have an option to collaborate and therefore to protect each other, to say they did not commit the crime. They have to make their choice individually, and that is important. Here is the twist to the story. If Alice confesses and essentially betrays Bob, she would go free and Bob would get a maximum prison sentence, let's say in this case 3 years. If Bob confesses, betrays Alice, and Alice keeps quiet, then Bob goes free and Alice gets a maximum prison sentence, let's say, again, 3 years. So if they both cooperate and remain silent, they get a punishment, but they get a lesser punishment, which would be like 1 year for each of them. And if they both betray each other, they both confess, they get a medium punishment, 2 years in our example. What I would like to illustrate is that the best outcome, the optimal outcome here would be actually for both of them to get 1 year, like a smaller prison sentence, and cooperate. The best choice is in cooperation, but the individual choice is really against cooperation, because each actor here, Alice and Bob, they are motivated to individually to actually not cooperate and to betray each other, unfortunately, because this is how the logic goes and this is how the decision making goes. So if they not cooperate, they end up with a suboptimal outcome. And if they cooperated, kept quiet, did not betray each other, they would get a small sentence, but not they would avoid a larger sentence. The key message from me in this game theory, in action, the prisoner's dilemma, is that cooperation is the key to success, but it is really hard to establish because individually we are not always interested and motivated by circumstances to cooperate. And finally, I would like to provide you a practical takeaway. So as a public official, what can you do if you would like to anticipate unintended consequences, if you would like to capture uncertainty, and if you would like to make the right choice in the face of a complex, dynamic system unfolding in front of your eyes? Whatever challenge you're dealing with, I suggest this so-called XLRM method, and you can do it with just pen and paper on your desk, or you can use, of course, some online resources. And these are the factors you need to consider: uncertainty factors, policy levers, performance metrics, and importantly and crucially, relationships. Let us go through a case study. We all remember COVID-19 pandemic. We all remember how governments around the world were battling with this major challenge. So what do? Do we introduce a lockdown? Do we close schools? Do we close some major events? Do we ask people to wear protection? How do we address pandemic? Let's try to analyze the pandemic response according to the uncertainties, policy levers, measures of success, and relationships. So first of all, we ask ourselves a question: what uncertain factors outside our control affect our ability to pursue our goals? In case of the COVID-19 pandemic, think about yourself in 2020 or so. What were the uncertain factors? Well, they were mostly natural phenomena. How deadly is the virus? We did not exactly know it back then. Does it affect only vulnerable people, or is it highly dangerous for all population, healthy and the vulnerable ones? Another uncertain factor, how does the virus spread? Remember, we also didn't know it back then. We didn't know if you actually need to touch the surface to get the virus, or does it spread by within which distance. We knew that the proximity to a virus carrier was important, but we didn't know how close we could or could not come to somebody carrying the virus to remain safe. So there was a big debate around the safety distance. Is it 1 meter, 1.5 meter, or 2 meters? And it was a great deal for businesses when such measures were introduced. You have to list the uncertain factors outside our control. For example, how fast the virus spreads and how deadly it is, and how does it actually spread. Then we move on to the next category. What are you trying to achieve, and how importantly you will measure your success? Well, back then, we sort of knew that the solution is in vaccination. But we also knew that we need time to develop a vaccine, to test the vaccine, and to make sure it's safe enough to produce so-called herd immunity by vaccination rather than naturally. So what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to buy out time to manage the vaccine, to actually make it? Then this is one goal, and certain measures of success. How much time could we buy out in order to pursue our goal? And how many people were affected by virus, but also to what extent? So what were the impacts? And then when we are clear about the metrics of success, we are clear about our goal, we move on and ask, what actions might we take to get there? So we need to invest some money in developing the vaccine, and then in handling the vaccine to the population. We need to develop public information campaigns. We may introduce lockdowns. We may also ask people behave in certain manner, wear protective masks. So if we and then we move on after we listed the actions to the relationships, and that is the main point here. Relationships show how a particular choice of policy levers, given a certain set of uncertainties, map into a particular set of goals. So you can try to map it all out in front of you and think about a simple example. Well, if you make, say, masks mandatory, compulsory, as government in a particular country, how you make sure that people have access to the masks, because there might be not enough. Also, they cost money. So if people want to go to a supermarket to buy bread or milk, will you actually hand them the protective masks for free? Will you ask them to keep the mask, maybe wash it, use it several times? How do you provide this information? How do you justify your actions? If you shut schools, is it justifiable to not close businesses? If you close businesses, say restaurants and coffee shops, well, what will happen to the business owners? What will happen to the economy? These are great, big, major questions governments were battling with, as you can remember, over many, many months before at least a certain solution was found, which was, in our case, vaccination. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope this example was useful and maybe did prompt some questions. I welcome questions at this point. I also would like to acknowledge the sources of visuals, and any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Olga. It's just recapping on some of the points that you had mentioned about the boomerang effect, the complexity theory for decision-making and skills, and tools and attitudes in approaching complexity, the game theory in action, especially the prisoner's dilemma, and robust decision makings. For small island states in the Pacific, we face unique challenges such as vulnerability to climate change, resource constraint, and isolation from global markets. What advice would you give to policy and decision makers to boost their productivity as they navigate through these uncertainties?
Thank you so much for your question, Fulori. Well, the grand challenges you mentioned, and I mentioned several during my talk, they are the same for everyone around the world. They are happening and unfolding. However, Importantly, the impact may be very different depending on the size and scale of the economy we are talking about. I would argue that, first of all, first and foremost, climate change requires a collective effort, and that is an ultimate solution. This is a challenge which exists across the national borders, and only collectively, by implementing collaborative efforts, we can achieve sustainable outcome in this case. However, in terms of smaller sized economies, we need to also understand that sometimes, in many cases, in fact, they can be impacted at a larger scale, because when a size of an economy is small, that means this economy would have a smaller buffer to meet the consequences and to respond to challenges, to protect the most vulnerable part of the population. So what do? We actually, the only way is to get better at anticipating, mitigating, considering the unintended consequences, because we can't stop them from happening. We can only get better at understanding them. And that's where the mechanisms and the frameworks I provided, I hope, might be helpful.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question to that climate change is impacted differently in different places around the world. Can you provide examples on these disparities and how we can work through these complexities?
You're absolutely right. We shall remember that many problems, if not all grand challenges, climate change included, they sometimes may have losers and winners, at least in the medium and short term. You would probably argue, and I would agree, that longer term, we would all lose out if you not make sure that you put that global effort in place, which I was talking about just a minute ago in response to your previous question. So we really need to have a grand strategy to address climate change related challenges. But to explain what may be the disparity here, imagine there are some places around the world now which are not suitable for agriculture. So when the climate is warming, it's obviously warming differently in different places around the world. But when it is warming, certain places may become suitable for agriculture. So certain locations may actually experience certain, it sounds surprising, but positive impacts in the short term and maybe even medium term, but most certainly not in the long term. So we have to recognize that there are different, sometimes conflicting interests, and it is not easy for governments to give up on their short-term interests altogether to only consider long-term, which is obviously more important. It is good to recognize conflicting lines of interest and try to work alongside them, so to smooth out as much as possible these disparities. But it's important to not ignore them. We don't only have losers of climate change and other grand challenges, which will lose out at the same scale. We are all impacted differently. And that's the dilemma. Remember the prisoner's dilemma. The collective, the collaboration, collective effort is always the key, but we need to get there. And also to get there, we need to recognize that sometimes self-interested individuals, well, they're not always motivated to put this collective effort in place. So we need maybe to restrict and to make sure they are motivated. The key solution here is to adopt a long-term version as much as possible and to avoid short-termism.
Thank you, Dr. Olga. For your final question, policymakers are always busy. What is your advice that if you have a good day job and would like to adopt the systems approach, but then you don't have time?
Well, I realize you're absolutely right on this, Fulori. I realize that sometimes you don't have time. You may find certain approaches excellent, wonderful, but you just don't have money. You don't have time to put all these great things in place. A rule of thumb when time is tight on your side is to focus on one connection. So try to think outside of your immediate circle and reinforce one connection at a time. Maybe reach out to another government department and seek to speak to an official, maybe sometimes more junior than you, or in some cases more senior that what you normally would do, and reinforce this connection. So how can we solve maybe two problems with just one policy? How can we introduce a package of policies together? We need collaboration. Sometimes we need collaboration across departments. Sometimes we need collaboration across sectors. So we may need to reach out to farmers as government officials and actually look at their perspective, how they experience their problems while they're actually busy milking cows, and that's what farmers do. So you need to offer solutions across borders, across relationships. And I not only speak about national borders, I also speak about the borders between teams, between departments, but ultimately across countries and economies. So focus on one connection outside of your immediate circle and try to reinforce it, to establish it as much as you possibly can.
Thank you, Dr. Olga, for your valuable insights and contributions on boosting public sector productivity by navigating complexities. And I agree with you that collaboration is the key to navigating our economies through this myriad of complexities. And I would like to leave the viewers with the thoughts of Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman, and I quote, "Productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is everything." Therefore, this topic is a timely one. And with that, I would like to conclude this session of P-Talk and look forward to many more sessions in the future. Thank you, Dr. Olga.
Thank you so much, Flori.
Thank you.